You're watching Morning at NTV.
Welcome back. Thank you for making us the #1 breakfast show in the country. Of course, now we're getting into a Kickstarter conversation, and we'll be looking at yesterday's feature of a panorama, and of course the story pretty much touching on the earthquake that took place in 2016, actually striking Rakai and Chotara districts, causing the death of 4 people, cause of injuries and loss of property. Now, government promised to offer help to the locals who were in dire need. 3 years after or later, the earthquake whose epicenter was in Tanzania, no one has come to their rescue. And in the most pretty much form of discrimination, the Ugandan government donated about 738 million Uganda shillings to the victims affected by the earthquake in Tanzania, but abdicated its responsibility to the scores of citizens who were affected right here in these 2 districts. Now, a total of 13, pretty much 3,000, beg your pardon, of houses, including schools, structures, developed cracks after this particular earthquake. The disaster forced more than 4,000 people in the villages of Chifamba, Kanabulemu, Chibanda, Chebe, and Kasansero in Gwanda and Gwanda, Chotara, and Rakai districts to abandon their homes and seek shelter under trees and banana plantations.
Wow, one of the poorest pockets of the country, the land in Rakai and Chotara is blighted by tragedy and ruin right there. And to talk to us about the story of Rakai is our investigations editor, Mr. Emmanuel Mtaiziwa, whose panorama story yesterday focuses on the disaster that hit the border district. And he joins us right now in studio. Good morning, Mr. Emmanuel.
To you.
Welcome to NTV.
Thank you so much. Good morning to you.
First off, Mr. Mtaiziwa, tell us about Kasensero. Why did you choose to go back there?
It's very interesting. Before I came in to talk about the story, you guys were talking about equitable service.
True.
In regard to patients who had been detained at a hospital. It bears parallels with this kind of situation, that we have a country where we don't practice any semblance of equitable service. So generally, this is an earthquake that happened about 3 years ago in 2016. It was definitely a very busy year, as you recall, the presidential poll and the other general election. And people were affected, and these are poor local communities. And one thing very peculiar about the people in Rakai, we must recall, is the first incidence of HIV/AIDS. That scourge that, scarred families and left many children orphaned happened in Rakai. Rakai has since split into another district in 2017. Chotara was carved out. So in a nutshell, what am I talking about? These are the poorest communities where you barely find social services like proper roads, proper health centers, water, electricity, and the things that we take for granted. The very basics are lacking in this place. On top of that, like I said, this place has a very peculiar history because many people died of HIV, you remember, in the early 80s. I think the first case that was recorded of HIV was in Rakai. So many kids were orphaned, because as you recall, in the 80s and later on in the early 90s, Uganda had one of the highest HIV prevalence rates in the world. So many people, many families, many kids were orphaned, and then comes this earthquake and it destroys everything, including houses, including businesses, including schools, including health centers and everything else. And government comes in and says, well, we'll give you a shot in the arm, we'll give you some funding so that you can construct your homes. What is very specific, I recall, is when government went in, the first thing they did is to bring food aid, which I think, in my view, was, right. But the people are a bit, reluctant to take in the food because their argument was, please, we are fairly food secure. What we need is the housing material. And then government committed to provide roofing materials. The president visited the area. I think the prime minister visited as well. The ministers for disaster visited. 3 years down the road, there's nothing
to show.
But what is also the real travesty is how you take $200,000 to the neighboring state, because the epicenter of this earthquake was in Tanzania.
Right.
You give money, it's like your kids are starving and you give money to your neighbor. It's a travesty of justice. And then two, we also have seen incidents. I mean, we've had disasters elsewhere in Bududa, in other parts of the country, and government has been able to deliver aid. So the question is, why the people of Rakai and Chotera?
And you know, that's a pertinent question, because as we're looking at the numbers, like you said, 738 million the government of Uganda did give to Tanzania. Now, someone will try and justify it and say that maybe it's a question of making sure that our diplomatic relationship is, you know, at par and is at a good state. But looking at our coffers in terms of our financial strength and capacity, what are the people down there saying with regards to the same? What could that 738 million Uganda shillings have done for them, bearing in mind that they have a history of negativities, history of poverty, even currently they're still crying foul? What could it have done if you can break it down to the reality of what that money could have done to the residents of Rakai and Chotera?
Well, first and foremost, there are several ways of, you know, being courteous to your neighbor and, you know, I mean, ensuring that you have very good diplomatic ties. I mean, don't antagonize your neighbor. Don't arrest citizens or Tanzanian citizens in Uganda. Have, you know, good cordial relations. Do trade. We're part of the East African community with Tanzania. We have the pipeline deal that's coming up. We are trying to get through Tanzania. So basically enhance commerce and do all these good things. Enhance the free movement of goods, free movement of labor. But when it comes to the issue of who you are as a country, what matters first is sovereignty. The people within your territorial boundaries are the first priority before you can think about the people outside. It just doesn't make sense whatsoever that you think you're pulling off a diplomatic, you know, masterstroke by giving people money and leaving your very own household to go hungry. You've talked about what 700 million shillings or whatever it is exactly can do. 700 million shillings, in my view, and which is what is the most pertinent need for the locals, the communities that we've spoken to, is it can construct homes. And we're not talking about, you know, these very nice bungalows that people have in the city, but it is something that, you know, you can start with. It's not so much money, it's not so much money, but it can do something. It can build boreholes in these communities. It can build a new 3 health centers where women can have facilities to be able to deliver. To be able to deliver, because the situation in that place is very dire. Women are giving birth on the concrete slab. Women are giving birth by the roadside because there's a very horrible road through Maragarambo Forest Reserve. So you need to take another 40 kilometers to access a health center with a doctor. So when it's raining, the road is extremely slippery, and the locals have challenges to move. So that money can do lots of stuff. It can also as well build structures for primary schools, because in these places there's barely any, you know, secondary school, for instance.
And also the schools that were there, you know, developed cracks, and, you know, students are in fear of even, you know, being under there or inside these classrooms,
True.
fearing that it could collapse
That is
on
true.
them.
That's
So,
true.
And the resident right there was saying that you have to walk 30 kilometers to find your first secondary school in this area.
Exactly.
It's an appalling situation, but then one would ask, why did the president first consider Tanzania first? Was he trying to secure that international public relations? Did it work for him? Because we saw in 2017, August, Mr. Magufuli at the border right there saying that, yes, indeed, President Museveni was pivotal when it came to rescuing, as a first responder, rescuing the victims of the earthquake. But what he didn't know that our very own people had been neglected in that regard. Now, let me just take you to a scenario on Friday. The president was on BBC, and he said the reason Bobi Wine couldn't be holding his concerts was because of the comments he made in September of last year, while he was overseas on Al Jazeera. Bobi Wine did say that America should stop funding the Uganda, giving us military assistance, because that money is used to suffocate opposition in Uganda. It was against that background that the president said that this was the main reason why we couldn't let Bobi Wine hold his concerts, because he's saying the country is not secure, but yet it's the same person who wants to enjoy the prosperity that we brought forth. So it got me thinking. In 2016, after the earthquake struck, a month later, the president shows up and he pledges 30 iron sheets, iron bars, and cement. And then a little bit later on, they send food to these affected areas. And the people rejected it. Now, it got me thinking, could this have been the reason the government sat back and said, okay, if they are rejecting our food, we shall also withhold our assistance and take it somewhere else, Sebududa? Could that have been the reason?
I don't have...
Is politics involved?
I don't have any cogent evidence in regard to giving an answer. What I think in this regard is the way the president runs his business. He prefers to micromanage. And honestly, when you're serving a population of 40 million people, perhaps you're bound to forget.
Forget?
Yes. So I think the approach should be have institutions follow up. Because honestly, you cannot be everywhere. You cannot be micromanaging in regard to service delivery. Institutions should work. We have a whole Department of Disaster Preparedness in the office of the OPM. They should have followed up this. But what's so absurd is several times when the members of parliament have brought up this issue, and you can see pent-up frustration on their faces. They are facing a backlash from the electorate. The electorate needs answers. Their jobs are on the line because someone would say you didn't deliver.
Mr. Mtaizi,
why is it that the Prime Minister has failed to respond? Why is it the sector ministers in charge of disaster preparedness are not responding? This is a very simple issue.
An official that day when they were distributing that food said, if you're refusing this food, we are going to take it to the people that need it the most. Say the people in Bududa, right there. It got me thinking that this was an emotional impulse. This official said it bluntly. If you refuse our help, we are going to take it somewhere else. So me, I'm thinking this could have been the reason why government left and never came back. I don't think they forgot. Just like the Bobi Wine issue, the president coming out bluntly and saying, hey, this is actually about politics. We are stopping this man from doing these concerts because he said some things that I didn't think were okay last year. So here in Rakai, the residents, don't you think they misfired by refusing that aid and the president was rubbed the wrong way?
We need to be very careful here. That even when we're giving help, we must look at the priority. And I think it was quite unprofessional by the person who made these comments that will take away this food aid if you're not, if you're not eager to take the food. It's very clear. The need, if you're giving me help and it's in the form of aid, I should be able to make a choice and say, please don't give me A, give me B.
Right.
I'm going to sleep outside my home and it's raining, there are mosquitoes, there are all sorts of terrible things in the night. My family is young and vulnerable. So my priority is, please give me the iron sheets. Please give me the cement, and I reconstruct my home.
Right.
I have food in the garden. So I don't think the community in Chotera and the community in Rakai were extreme to make. I mean, that's some bit of emotion, definitely.
True.
First of all, this is a very poor community that feels they are the underclass and neglected. So they have this pent-up frustration. And here you are, you come, and you're not giving them what they deserve. And the building materials, as well as the food, costs money.
Right.
So why don't you give them what they prefer?
So
What they
ideally,
need.
yes. So ideally, government should have given them the
Exactly.
pledge of 30 iron sheets, iron
Exactly.
bars, and cement,
government
and
promised
then
that.
after bring in the food. But then it was the
Exactly.
other way around.
Exactly.
Mala?
Now, let's look at the leadership there. Just in that particular video, we did see Mr. Kalemba, the Kakuto Member
Yes,
of Parliament, saying that they have tried all they could, but government is not hearing or listening to their cries. He said that even him himself, is pretty much worried that he will not be re-elected, come that next, phase where the people there will have a voice to select the leadership. Him saying that even the residents there, at times speculate and say maybe this aid was actually given, maybe this monies were actually, given out, but the leaders use this money for ulterior, things or motives, so to speak. So let me ask you this question. In terms of disaster preparedness, now that it seems that even the leaders there don't have a convincing voice to make government move, let's talk about preparedness. Borrowing from what we've been seeing year in, year out in Bududa. 2018, we saw the landslides. There was a lot of noise, trying to, pretty much people saying that, hey, don't you think it's time for us to just forcefully relocate these people? June 2019, just mid this year, another one struck. Now, in terms of earthquakes, this is natural disasters. No one foresees this. Even the landslides, well, we can prepare, we can evict fully, forcefully evict them. But with earthquakes, it's something totally different. The leaders don't have a voice to get that aid. What then? What does the future of fate hold for the residents, and what are they saying? Are they in fear of another happening in terms of earthquakes?
Well, it's like you said, it's very for countries like Uganda, it's extremely difficult for us to have the capacity to detect things like earthquakes. What I know is Japan is one of the countries that has the most sophisticated system in terms, one of the most sophisticated in detecting earthquakes and tsunamis and this kind. And this is because of where the place it occupies in the Pacific. Now, when it comes to Uganda, the way the OPM handles disasters is quite knee-jerk. And first and foremost, I think the money that's allocated is fairly small. And many times we react after that. We do more of a post-mortem than addressing the issue. So we can't tell when there's going to be another earthquake. It would be extremely sad that another earthquake perhaps strikes this place. But what is on the ground, what is an eye can see, what is the pain and anguish of these people is their homes collapsed and became rubble. The few that managed to stay up have cracks, and people have since moved out of these homes. There's this anecdote in the story of this woman who, on her using her very own small savings, has decided to erect a new, some makeshift kind of structure.
Right.
But she still has challenges, the mosquitoes, the rains. So you need to give these people support. And this support should not come 10 years after. And this support should not be through political lenses where you're trying to, dispense patronage. Like when you think an election is coming, it should be given as part and parcel of service delivery.
Do you have a few of the residents there, Romy, if you can allow me, who have said that, hey, let us save, let us make sure that we have the financial muscle and relocate in fear of a second happening in terms of earthquakes? Because what we know is with history of earthquakes, you know, there are areas that are prone to stuff, to such, beg your pardon. And once it happens the first time, there's a high possibility of it happening again. So do we have residents who have said, if government is doing nothing, let us, you know, maybe save up and move? Do we have residents who have relocated, perhaps?
Well, the pleas I've had is some of the residents actually have asked to become Tanzanian citizens, because I don't think
it was very appalling.
I don't think I come from a place that's fairly prone to earthquakes in Fort Portal, but I've never heard of communities migrate to other places, move to other places because there's an earthquake. Because honestly, with Uganda, we're not California, we're not some places in China or elsewhere where you have an earthquake on the Richter scale of 8. It's usually 5, a few deaths, which is very unfortunate, and houses collapsing. So I don't think there are any communities that are planning to move, because we've never had, you know, that extreme kind of situation.
Right.
What is the real concern of the people is how can government, now that this earthquake happened, which is a natural, you know, tragedy,
right,
which was very unexpected, how can we ensure that we provide, you know, we're able to at least come to the aid of these people who are ailing? And what we must recall is government, Chapter 4 of our Constitution provides for some of these rights. Rights to education, access to health, access to maternal health for the women, and all these things. And we've ratified a number of international instruments in this regard. So why can't we at least practice, try to put in practice these things? Is it so hard to find some of this money and deliver iron sheets? When we spend, it's also a question of choice. When we spend on so many superfluous expenditures,
yet people are suffering
foreign
in the
travel,
country.
and this is where the problem is. You spend. You've just been talking about, before I came in, the patients who are being detained in hospitals.
right,
You spend on one part billions of shillings treating VIPs out of this country in first-class hospitals. You don't equip hospitals, and mothers die while giving birth. People die of negligible afflictions. People die of things that should have been treated. That's where the concern is.
Well, these areas have gone through quite a tumultuous times. You also remember in 1979, as the Ugandan and Tanzanian forces were trying to oust, they pounded these areas with a lot of artillery right there. So they've suffered too much. You also had HIV, the 80s, the 90s, and then the earthquake in 2016 right there. So you have so many people saying this could be a human rights issue because these people are entitled to health, education, and a lot more. So you also have the coordinator of public interest lawyers coming out and reining in and saying, well, this is a human rights problem. And also the woman MP for Chotera, that's Robina Sentongo, she also came out to say that actually in the Constitution it's provided for government must step in and do its work. But Mr. Emma, do you think this is a human rights issue that should be taken up?
Yes, definitely. It's an issue to do with human rights, and the protection of these rights must be done manifestly through service delivery, and the state as a duty bearer must show cause, must be able to come in and provide, because that's why it has this responsibility.
So if government fails to provide, can the locals sue?
Well, in regard to that, definitely they can, because, they are fairly not well off, so they can engage in what is known as public interest litigation and be able to demand for these rights. Because what is very important is also the article in Chapter 4, which talks about equality and non-discrimination. I think it's Article 21 of the Constitution. So there's no reason why we should be able to see government responding in certain areas. For instance, Bududa, and elsewhere where people, you know, are victims of these natural calamities. And for the case of Chotera and Rakai, we see no response whatsoever. That is extremely, extremely unfair to the locals, and it becomes an issue about human rights, because people are not able to have safe housing. The children who are supposed to go to school are not able to go to school. People cannot access proper medical health care. These are very fundamental human rights issues.
You know, Emmanuel, I listened in critically, especially to the voices of the residents there in Rakai and Chotera, and they were actually giving a comparison to how government is actually aiding, you know, Bududa residents. And, you know, it's not a Ugandan phenomenon where we've seen governments only moving where there's a big number of people who have lost their lives. You know, whenever it's 4, 5, government just, you know, it's okay. It's another number. But when there are big numbers, then government wakes up. Do you think that's the same reaction, or the reaction, the lethargy that you're seeing is because of that? Because they're saying 4 is not
it's really
a big
about
number?
the detail of the kind of calamity. 4 people dying in an earthquake, well, may not look such a big number. But it's very, these are Ugandans. And these are people, they've lost their lives, and families. But what we must look at is the impact of this earthquake. I think the figures are very clear.
Right.
Thousands of homes with cracks, others totally turned into rubble. Hospitals with cracks, schools with cracks that students cannot go in there and learn. So the impact of an earthquake, that's why an earthquake perhaps happens once in a while. The impact is what we're talking about. People's livelihoods are disrupted.
Right.
People living, no longer living in their homes and seeking shelter under trees and these kind of things. So it's really not a question about numbers in my view whatsoever. It's a question to do with how do you respond when a poor community
is afflicted.
Yes.
Wow, and the devastation was really immense. You saw that hospital, Chebe Health Center, Tubala, the roof was almost caving in right there. And there were reports that mothers were just having their babies in the corridors. It was just an appalling situation right there. In my mind, I was like, how could government have neglected these people for the last 3 years? Mr. Mtaiziwa, could it have been the response plan? Some people are saying that the contingency fund is actually empty. Even in Bududa, whenever there is a disaster right there, they have to go and check in the contingency fund, find a zero, and they have to get money from other avenues. Could it have translated to the slow response right here in Rakai? Absence of money in the contingency fund.
It's not a question about absence of money. It's a question about priorities. It's a question about priorities. We host so many concerts. So
someone can just wake up and say, the people on Rakai can just wait. We have other issues to handle.
Honestly, let's look at just one simple item. How much money does government spend? And I'm talking generally, including parliament, including all these government institutions. I don't want to cherry pick. It's billions of shillings. And what do people go to do outside? To earn allowances. Billions of shillings. And, you know, go shopping in the, you know, first class malls in the first world. This money, half of that money can improve, can make a change on the ground in these poor communities in Chebe and elsewhere.
Right.
It can do a lot of change. So it's not a question of the limited resource envelope. Not at all, not whatsoever. Government can even say tomorrow we're going to stop buying fuel guzzlers, for instance, the Land Cruiser. We're going to stop buying Land Cruisers for our VIPs and ministers and these people.
Right.
That money can be channeled into a much more productive.
So it's a question of political will.
It's purely a question of priority, and I don't know why we don't see these things.
Right.
and I don't know why these things were visible at the start, perhaps when this regime had just come into power and had promised. You recall the communities in Luwero were fighting alongside them. That really these guys are coming to take power to fight for the interest of the peasant, of the common man. And when you buy a fuel guzzler, a minister who is fairly well off, and you forget the common man, peasant,
what does that
I
mean?
don't think it doesn't resonate.
Okay.
Well, right there, Mr. Emma, like I did mention while we were starting this conversation, I did tell you that it could have been an emotional impulse. After these people refused the food, I have some reason to believe that government was offended in that regard and said, okay, if they do not want the food that we are giving them, the fast help, then we should altogether let this one go. Because the lady in that video was pretty specific. If you refuse this food, we shall take it to Bududa. She actually said, you would have actually accepted the food and told us your problems, which we would have taken to our superiors to be implemented. It could have been an emotional impulse, just if you try to connect it to the Bobby Wine issue being stopped from hosting his concerts just because of comments he made a year ago, meaning it can still come biting you in, right there. So what are we dealing with? Emotional politics? Right there? That's the $64,000 question right there. Yes.
Well, like I said before, I don't think the person who made this comment, this was quite a professional comment. And you know, an individual who is working for government does not entirely represent the views of government. Yes, they are the agents of government, but do they really... Are those the views of the entire ministry and OPM
so
that is in charge?
So there could be much more that is playing into this particular scenario.
So in essence, someone making that kind of comment, I think, is out of the boundaries. These are people who have been affected, and there's no need. Government should have a thick skin.
Right.
And then too, you talk about Bobby Wine and, you know, the stick that the state is using to beat him because they believe he's gone to the West and he's portrayed government badly and there's flack from the West. I think it's a little bit much more complex than that if we're talking about military aid from the US. What you must recall is Uganda has for a very long time been viewed as the kind of anchorman in the troubled Great Lakes. And Uganda for long has been, you know, seen as a willing ally with the West, the US, and the other powers in the fight against terrorism in the Horn of Africa enclave as a proxy. So it's much more complex in that regard. And I think to speak to the question about pragmatic politics, I think Bobby Wine as a politician will look to expose the government at its most vulnerable spots. He's not going to sit back and, you know, go around and because he's seeking power.
So ideally we are dealing with sensationalistic politics right there. Emmanuel Mtaiziwa, investigations editor, our very own. We've been bantering about that story that was highlighted yesterday in the Panorama segment on NTV tonight right there. The people of Chotera, Rakai grappling 3 years after the earthquake that razed down over 200 schools, 3,186 homes left with cracks, people living under banana plantations, and still no help from government. But right here you've heard what we've had to say on this, and especially what Emma had to say in this regard. Government should rein in even tomorrow and do something to help these people. You're still watching Morning at NTV. Right about now we're going to take a very short break and return with a lot more exhilarating information. Keep it here.